Hello, hi. Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us for this week's HSS seminar series. It's our great pleasure to have Dr. Tom Sewel present his work, The Fascist Superhero, at the seminar series today. Just a brief sort of introduction, Dr. Tom Sewel has a first class MA in English Literature and Arts and Media Informatics from the University of Glasgow and was awarded a PhD in English from the University of Calgary in 2023 for his dissertation titled Spirits in the Gutter, the British Invasion and the Haunting of the 20th Century. He is the Secretary of the International Comparative Literature Association's Standing Research Committee on Comic Studies and Graphic Narrative. He is the PI and Director of the FIF-funded South Asian Speculative Fiction Database project and has been an Assistant Professor of English at LUMS since January 2024. So as is sort of customary for the format, we'll have about 30 to 40 minutes for the presentation and then we'll have question and answers. Over to you, Tom.
Great, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to all of you for coming along today. So I want to talk today about one of the central arguments of my PhD thesis. Put very simply, you can probably guess from the title, the idea that the figure of the superhero in all its forms always leans towards and lends itself to a politics of fascism. This, I understand, is a somewhat provocative claim, and one that some of my fellow comic scholars tend to get quite defensive about. I will argue there's not only a strong case to be made for this proposition, but that a reckoning with the figure of the superhero is timely, overdue, and indeed urgent in a way that only a few questions in the study of literature can claim to be. So just to give some context for the argument I'll present today, my PhD dissertation, Spirits in the Gutters, the British Invasion and the Haunting of the 20th Century, analyzes the comics works of a constellation of 5 British writers who went to the US in the 80s and 90s to work for American comics publishers. My dissertation argues that the impact of this group of writers instigated a sea change of generational proportions in the direction of American comics writing from the late 80s to the early 2000s. This change began with an increased focus on textuality and the tropes of literary storytelling, things like unreliable narrators, non-linear narratives, and political allegory especially. But it was always accompanied by and generative of an innovative and experimental approach to the mechanics of visual storytelling in terms of the manipulation of layouts, panels, gutters, and other concrete elements of the comics page. US superhero comics written and illustrated by US creators published subsequent to the British invasion and up to the present day continue to reflect these deep shifts in the aesthetic and literary preoccupations inaugurated by the authors of the British invasion, with Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, and Warren Ellis chief among them. So at stake in this sea change is the figure of the unreconstructed all-American superhero as a symbol of hope, justice, morality, and honor. The British invasion authors brought a critical, intellectualized cynicism to their own superhero writing, and for the purpose of this talk today, I'm going to be focusing on these literary storytelling aspects of the changes wrought by these authors, with particular attention on this very cynical attitude towards the figure of the superhero as a kind of idealized avatar of nationalistic animus, an idolized champion of the principle of retributive violence, and a persona that is always imbued with a sublime ideological luminosity. So this jaded perspective on the superhero inaugurated by the invasion authors marked a radical departure from the previous decades of US superhero writing, in which the narratives are almost universally simplistic, Manichaean tales of good versus evil. Through their prolific comics works, the Asian invasion authors subverted these simple moralistic narratives of mid-20th century US comics. And in constructing the superhero with an explicit eye on the complex moral and political problems it represents, they shifted these kinds of comics into a fundamentally darker and more mature place where might no longer guaranteed right. this impact endures today in the seemingly endless waves of superhero films that have pushed the genre from the margins to the mainstream of popular culture in recent years. And so most relevant to my talk today, even where these cynical, politically iconoclastic, aesthetically innovative, and morally, I want to say like hyper-conscious writers aimed to subvert or degrade the kind of fascistic essence of the figure of the superhero using parody, satire, hyperbole, ridicule, or other such writerly devices, they are unable to entirely escape or evade the property of superheroes to feed into a politics of submission and surrender to an idealized, totalizing image of the self. Before I proceed any further with the discussion of superheroes, comics, and the authors of the British invasion, I want to first discuss this term, fascism. So I think it's worth spending a little time to clarify how I am thinking of fascism here, because the term has for a long time been hopelessly overdetermined. There are, of course, a great many theorists of fascism as a political tendency, too many to offer any kind of comprehensive overview of their ideas. And this is not any way a particularly useful exercise, nor my intention, to exhaustively define the characteristics of fascist politics. Rather, I will turn to a 1995 article by Ray Chow, published in Ariel, Journal of Postcolonial Studies, called "The Fascist Longings in Our Midst." So Chow is primarily a Foucauldian theorist interested in how the structures of knowledge and power interact with each other to produce social effects. And her article here is a scathing indictment of the state of postcolonial studies in the North American Academy in the late 90s. I'm not going to delve too deeply into that aspect of her argument today, although I encourage you to read the article. I will, however, analyze her theory of fascism as a politics that is obsessively centered around aesthetics. And in this, Chow builds on an analysis first established by Walter Benjamin, who towards the end of his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, offers the claim that, you can see here, mankind's self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is the situation of politics which fascism is rendering aesthetics. So, Benjamin sees revealed in fascism's fixation with aesthetics the need for a mythologizing discourse upon which the concrete horrors of fascist states can justify their projects. This focus on the aestheticization of politics, that is, on the transmuting of political differences, priorities, tensions, and so on, into aesthetic differences, priorities, and tensions, is the first step in disarming political resistance to fascist politics. And the aesthetics of fascism are, for this reason, essentially inextricable from the politics of fascism. I'm getting upstaged by a cat here.
Tough competition.
Chow's essay develops a fine-grained analysis of the construction, articulation, and propagation of fascist aesthetics, which I will argue provides a salient theoretical apparatus for thinking about the cultural work in which the figure of the superhero is already always engaged. So Chow's discussion begins with an acknowledgement that the label fascist often obscures more than it reveals. Following Foucault, she points out that it's a kind of generalized laziness about locking down a specific definition of fascism that allowed this term to take on the properties of a floating signifier, unattached to any kind of concrete ontology. The function of the term fascism in cases like this is essentially to serve as a kind of blanket denunciation. It's a label we stick onto any manifestation of a politics that we deem unacceptable, undesirable, or intolerable. And Chow develops this point in terms of the Freudian lack. arguing that the word fascism has become this kind of empty term, a blank screen onto which we are encouraged to project our vision of whatever forms the dialectical other to the democratic, rationalist, capitalist liberalism that forms the core ideological backbone of the post-war political consensus in the industrialized Western nations. Fascism, in this light, is everything that the presumptive we, the enlightened liberal do-gooders of the world, identify as other to our political project. It is figured as the darkness to our light, the night to our day, the evil arrayed against our unquestionable good. And Chow is rightly suspicious of this kind of one-dimensional moral certainty. 10 years before Sarah Ahmed's book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, makes the argument that the mobilizing affect of white supremacist movements is not hate, but love. Love for family, love for children, love for homeland. Ray Chow asks us to consider the idealism that lies at the heart of every fascist project. Fascism does not ever present itself as a project of hate and destruction. It presents itself as a protector, as a builder, a guardian of the people, a champion and a guarantor of justice in a world where decency no longer exists. And we might think of this through the kind of hackneyed expression that nobody starts out as the villain of their own story. Right? A more colloquial way of thinking about fascism's negotiation of the tensions between its positivistic and idealized desires and the often horrific and traumatic outcome when those desires are realized. And so if we want to understand what makes fascism fascist, to understand why it appeals to the public, in order to analyze, resist, and ultimately, hopefully, defeat it, then Chow urges us to look at the times and places where fascism reveals the positive and decent impulses that provide the justifying bedrock for its monstrous deeds. And at the core of this aesthetic mission is what Chow describes here as the search for an idealized self-image through a heartfelt surrender to something higher and more beautiful. And this is the crucial insight upon which Chow's analysis hinges, and the reason that I've chosen her theorization of fascism as the framework for critiquing the figure of the superhero. Fascism demands that we surrender the self and submit to incorporation into an indivisible state that represents the agent of the people's mythologized destiny. It ensures this by presenting us with an idealized image of the perfected self as an avatar of the national spirit, to which there can be no moral resistance unless one is willing to place oneself outside the shield of the nation's protective embrace and become the other, the enemy. And so this bright and shiny, crude and colorful spectacle is at the heart of every fascist aesthetics. It is a mistake, Chow argues, to try to pin down fascism to a particular model or family of ideological production. The principle that unites fascist projects throughout history is not ideological, but aesthetic. And it's a commitment to the primacy of this idealized image with which the ordinary subject of the fascist state can identify themselves, can see their own desires embodied in, and in the end, joyously submit to their own assimilation into its representative totality. The subject surrenders their own moral and political agency to the superior wisdom and authority of this idealized figure who not only knows better, but who understands the interests of the totality better than any individual could hope to do. And in submitting to this identification, the individual partakes in all of the glory that accrues to this idealized representation of the mass. So better than text, better than audio, the image, or the picture, as Chow has it here, offers the most powerful means by which it is possible to show this idealized self as a singular, specific embodiment, a unitary principle that represents and ramifies every aesthetic principle of the fascist project. The Nazi propaganda images of the perfect Aryan man, the muscular, white, Nietzschean Superman, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed son of Prussia's fertile soil, the noble but humble working man to whom German fascism will restore the rightful fruits of his hard labor, played the role of this idealized image for the Third Reich. And Chow points out that by dint of its hyperbolic positivity, this archetypal figure, based on no real individual, assumes a kind of mythic character in the meta-narrative of the fascist state. He is by himself the reason that fascism must win. And he is the justification for any moral atrocity that is required to ensure victory. He is by definition the embodiment of all that is good and worthy, a figure who is powerful beyond imagination and simultaneously must be protected and supported against the lesser beings who are subsumed into his totalizing perfection. Chow argues that in the process of being fed this image, consuming it, we infantilize ourselves. It's no longer up to us to exercise our moral judgment or to make difficult decisions about the justice of our own words and deeds. Such principles are no longer political, but aesthetic. Their values already decided, fixed, made non-negotiable by this idealized image of the mythic fascist Superman. But Chow's analysis does not stop there. Her interest in defining fascism along these lines is in order to engage critically with what she calls the new liberal fascism that is being assimilated into the intellectual spaces of the contemporary West. If we are able to understand fascism as a project not tied to a specific political ideology, but rather one that exercises social control through an aesthetics of the idealized image, then we can begin to see quite readily how such images proliferate in political spaces that claim to be liberal or left-leaning or even explicitly anti-fascist. And it's with this framework for understanding fascism that I want to turn back now to the figure of the comic book superhero as an avatar of this pseudo-mythic, totalizing nationalist aesthetics that towers over contemporary mainstream culture. An early antecedent of the idea that superheroes are inherently fascist figures is found in the book Seduction of the Innocent, 1954, by the German-American psychiatrist Frederick Wertham. Wertham's findings were, and still are for the most part, treated as anathemic and unthinkable by those within the comics industry. And a direct line is often drawn between his critical work here and the introduction of the Comics Code Authority later the same year, which laid down very strict and ideologically conservative rules for the type of content that could be represented in mainstream US comics. So while comics industry professionals may maintain that Wertham's book was directly responsible for the code, its details were filtered primarily through a US congressional committee that was, perhaps predictably, more interested in stamping out any hint of sexual impropriety or disobedience to law enforcement. And the final form that the Comics Code took was the result of actually a very selective cherry-picking exercise in relation to Wertham's critique of superhero comics. So while Wertham's own sexually conservative politics informed much of his horror at the libidinous and often explicit imagery he found in the comic books of the 50s, his criticism of the figure of the superhero takes on a more measured and philosophical character relative to, for example, his quite reactionary outrage at the portrayal of women behaving in unladylike ways. And it remains an interesting outcome that, having been filtered through a congressional committee, the Comics Code Authority reflected almost entirely the latter set of concerns, and the former set, not at all, really. And whatever else might be said about Wortham's personal politics, and it's clear from his writing that he's not what we might recognize as progressive on issues of gender or sexuality, he does identify the respective racialization of superheroes and their counterpart villains as something very closely akin to the propaganda distributed by the German Nazi Party only a decade or so before his book was published. And you can see that argument on the screen up here. So his specific argument in this context is that the details of the content of individual superhero stories are less important, actually, than this overarching relationship to power that is reinforced through endless repetition. So either, as he says here, to paraphrase, either one fancies oneself the hero and is self-evidently superior to lesser beings and thereby freed from the constraints of normal morality, or one is psychologically prepared for the domination of society by such symbolic figures who promise to fix all society's problems by the application of a kind of self-validating violence. And this is a psychology that prepares the ground for authoritarianism of every type. Even when heroes are shown, as they often were since the 1940s, fighting Nazis hand to hand, their background image here that you can't really see at the moment is a picture of Captain America punching out Hitler in his first appearance. But even here, they don't represent any kind of democratic or liberatory impulse, but only the collision of two different and competing violent nationalisms. And so the social and political messages of superhero stories are all the more insidious because they are primarily aimed at the minds of children and teenagers. And it seems reasonable to ask in 2025 if the undeniably resurgent political presence of fascist movements in the UK, across Europe, and in the US throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s might not be related to the domination of cinematic entertainment over the last 2 decades by an overwhelming procession of dozens of superhero movies who reproduce and celebrate these fascistic relationships to power. Wortham argues that, quote, brutality in fantasy creates brutality in fact, end quote. And as the brutality of state power in the West ramps up against the homeless, the marginalized, the immigrant, the foreign, and the dissident, at the very moment that costumed paragons of supposed Western values have become the single largest entertainment franchise on the planet, it is surely incumbent on us to consider anew what role the figure of the superhero has played in this process. So Wortham's analysis of superheroes as propaganda in this regard is supported by the later scholarship presented by political historian Paul Hirsch's 2013 book. The dissertation was 2013, the book was 2021, called Pulp Empire, The Secret History of Comic Book Imperialism. So Hirsch relates that during the war, a body called the Writers' War Board, what he describes as a, quote, quasi-governmental agency, end quote, in the US, collaborated directly with comics publishers, particularly with Detective Comics, DC, to guide the tone and tenor of anti-German and anti-Japanese rhetoric in their publications. This collaboration resulted in a publication called This Is Our Enemy in 1945, a 40-page denunciation of the German people, culture, and Nazism in general, starring all of the most recognizable superheroes of the time, including Wonder Woman, the Green Lantern, the Flash, but almost entirely written and edited by members of the Writers' War Board, a government agency, to stoke up anti-German sentiment among American readers. So under the auspices of these covert government creators, the violence and gore in superhero comics was in fact ramped up to spark feelings of disgust and outrage and hatred. the Germans and the Japanese had to be presented as, quote, fundamentally, irredeemably evil and violent, end quote, in order to justify the mobilization of the American war effort. The ultra-violence abhorred by Wortham, and which later became a signature part of the comics works of the British invasion, had its origins in the wartime propaganda of the 1940s, where its purpose was to demonstrate to the American mass market that, we have the quotation here, a policy of unremitting violence was essential to the creation of a world in which democracy and tolerance could flourish. Hirsch notes that the publication of these comics coincided with the escalation of attacks against the civilian populations of the Axis countries, drawing a direct link between the narrative dehumanization of their people and the actual death and destruction rained on non-combatants by Allied militaries. Accompanying this racializing degradation of German and Japanese people as subhumans were paradoxical counterclaims about the liberal racial tolerance of the free and democratic United States that aimed to play down and minimize the long-standing racial inequalities within American society. So this double-edged function of wartime superhero comics to hyperbolically dehumanize the enemy as both individual and collective, while simultaneously representing American liberal democracy as a perfect society, has never entirely been expunged from superhero narratives, even 8 decades after the end of World War II. The popularity of a mass market genre aimed at a generally less than mature audience as a platform for nationalistic propaganda has proven hard for American comics publishers to let go of. It is, however, important to offer a caveat here and recognize that at the moment when Wortham was writing in 1954, the superhero genre of comics was already in the process of waning into something approaching obsolescence. Comics scholar Jean-Paul Gabellier, in the quotation on the screen here, describes the post-war shift in the comics market that all but wiped out the wartime superhero comics in favor of romance, western, and crime titles. When Wortham published his damning critique of the figure of the superhero in '54, those figures had already been largely supplanted in mass market comics by less luridly fantastic figures, for the most part, familiar from more traditional pulp stories such as pirates and cowboys and werewolves and vampires, and so on. And so this highly politicized propaganda comics featuring superheroes such as Superman, Captain America, battling Nazis had enjoyed widespread publication during the wartime years, but the arrival of peacetime saw a significant contraction in the publication of these sort of nationalistic narratives. Wortham's analysis might therefore already be seen to be a kind of problematically revisionist one, identifying explicitly anti-Nazi superheroes with the same kind of fascist ideology that they are presented as opposing. This counter-critique of Wortham's position fails to account for the point made previously that the nationalist anti-Nazi propaganda comics of the 30s and 40s are by no means inherently anti-fascist. Right? Anti-Nazi is not anti-fascist. Rather, they represent a similarly violent American nationalism that bears many of the same characteristics of its adversaries, such as like racial division, albeit under a different flag. And despite his status as the bête noire of the superhero comics industry and comic studies more generally, Wortham was not the first critic of the figure of the superhero to make their reservations known. A decade before Seduction of the Innocent, the media theorist and cultural historian Walter J. Ong published an article in the New York Times titled The Hero and the Superstate, recently republished in Charles Hatfield's Superhero Reader. Ong's critique, as may be inferred from the title of his article, concerns the role that the costumed superhero plays in consolidating the more explicit propaganda of fascist and authoritarian state entities in the minds of the people who occupy those states. Ong rejected explicitly the idea that seeing, for example, Captain America fighting Nazis inherently made Captain America a useful or successful means of combating domestic fascist nationalism. Anticipating Wortham, Ong argues that while the specific contents of such comics reveal their covert allegiance to strategies of state domination, the minutiae of these details matter less than the general relationship to state power that was being broadcast and reinforced through their weekly publication. Ong argues for an understanding of the function of the figure of the comic superhero that is directly connected to the functions of Nazi propaganda. Quote, "The comic's habit of tinkering with the notion of the hero as the emotional correlative of the whole nation matches exactly the technique of Hitler, who was the prototype and hero of those who wanted to be, quote, typical Germans," end quote. So for Ong, Superman and his costumed compatriots are prototypes for those who consider themselves typical Americans, itself a normalizing and deeply conservative construction that immediately and definitively excludes all varieties of marginalized people. Another part of Ong's critique that has a salutary relevance to contemporary pop cultural discussions about the place and role of the superhero focuses on the claim, which was common even in 1945, that superhero comics and the narratives they propagate represent a kind of modern American version of mythology or folklore. And this idea has come to almost overwhelming prominence in the last couple of decades and is frequently given both inside and outside of the academy as a reason superhero comics ought to be treated with the same kind of reverential respect given to ancient stories that have survived through hundreds or thousands of years of human history. And for Ong, this insistence is primarily revealing of the importance of superheroes in establishing a kind of covert nationalistic fervor. If superheroes are folktales and myths, then they are American folktales and myths. And they construct a notion of the folk based around subscription to the kinds of violent values that they describe. You see him making that argument here. The insistence that comics are a form of folklore works to disarm critical understanding of the cultural work that these figures do, as folklore and myth belong to a privileged category of literature that in many cases predates written literature itself. When critics and commentators argue, as many do, that superheroes are a kind of modern mythology, they elide the material histories that gave rise to and preserved mythologies down the centuries. And such arguments are not limited to the fringes of scholarship. Roland Barthes was the first person to argue that the cultural work done in the past by gods and epic sagas is now done by laundry detergent commercials and comic strip characters, end quote. So such claims egregiously elide the material circumstance of industrial mass culture from which comics emerge and in which they prosper, an apparatus that bears no resemblance to the kind of largely oral narrative transmission strata in which myths and folktales emerged and were propagated. The material historical reasons for the enduring significance and cultural prominence of the myth of, for example, Odysseus, are completely different from the reasons for the cultural prominence of, for example, Batman. Not only are they different in the material circumstance of their origins, but they belong to entirely different orders of narrative object and interpretive community. Yet, making the claim that Batman and Odysseus, or Beowulf and the Incredible Hulk, or Red Riding Hood and Spider-Man belong in each case in the same literary category of mythology and folklore as each other, is now often treated as a kind of unremarkable and uncontroversial contention across much of pop cultural discourse. Quite apart from the critical shallowness of such unsubstantiated claims, there is a danger, as Ong points out, in collecting the products of a mass industrial entertainment industry under the category, the rubric, if you like, of a kind of folkish culture. And when a sufficient mass of people have become convinced that superhero fables are indeed a form of North American folk mythology, then superhero narratives, with all the attendant fascist leanings identified by Wortham, begin to inscribe the qualities of a new North American folk. This new image of the folk is grounded in these primary colored heroic fantasies detached from material histories of capitalism, colonialism, dispossession, and oppression that produced contemporary North American culture and all of its unresolved tensions. A society whose ideals of truth and justice are upheld by a Superman who unquestionably represents the American way is not a society that is ready to confront its own participation in and responsibility for slavery and the genocide of the indigenous peoples of North America. So, as a case study for exploring this relationship between the figure of the superhero and an incipient fascist aesthetics, I want to turn now to look at one of the major canonical works of the comic genre. Along with Spiegelman's Mouse, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' comic Watchmen, first published as a series of 12 single issues in 1986, collected as a single volume in 87, is often regarded as being one of the comics whose textual density and kind of literary richness first summoned into being the term graphic novel. That category has all sorts of problems as a term of scholarship, but it's worth mentioning because as a marketing category, the graphic novel propelled comic books like Watchmen and Mouse out of the shadowy depths of specialist comic stores and onto the well-lit shelves of mainstream book retailers for the first time, in many ways making the current mainstreaming of the superhero possible in the process. Watchmen then is one of the comics that makes it possible to think of comics as literature. And as mentioned near the start of this talk, the political radicalism of Alan Moore and the other British invasion writers can be seen most tellingly in their cynicism about the figure of the superhero. While Moore's Watchmen has often been misleadingly called a deconstruction of the figure of the superhero, a point that I will gladly expand upon during Q&A if anyone is interested, but it takes too long to get into here. Watchmen is in fact something closer to an all-out attack on the institution of superhero comics and the gaudy, one-dimensional characters that populate their pages. Moore and Gibbons' comic begins from the premise that the superhero is an inherently conservative figure. The classical superhero always fights to protect and uphold the status quo from the supervillains who wish to transform it in some fundamental way. While Superman, for example, lives, America can never experience any kind of meaningful social change. It's trapped within a conception of the world that belongs to the mid-20th century, the 1950s specifically, where honest farm boys are the wellspring of the nation's moral virtue, and journalists are only ever bespectacled and honorable truth-tellers seeking to right injustice. And despite his alien birth, Superman emerges from this idealized 1950s Midwestern milieu, and he is so powerful and patriotic that he can defeat any challenge that might threaten to disrupt those values, those politics, or the assumed perfection of that social order. And in Watchmen, this insight that superheroes ultimately stand in the way of social progress forms the basis for the story's setting and shapes the role played by every character. In Watchmen's alternate history of the world, superheroes have existed since the late 1930s, participating in major events that altered the history of the 20th century, leading up to the comic's present day in 1985. So, for example, the Watergate conspiracy was never revealed in this world because the journalists that went to report on it were killed by superheroes working for the government. And Richard Nixon in 1985 remains the president of the US, locked in a kind of ever-escalating Cold War with the Soviet Union. And none of the heroic characters in Watchmen represent any kind of progressive hope for a world freed from American hegemony. In most cases, the opposite is true. So most obviously, in this respect, the comedian down center in this picture, Edward Blake, is a kind of unreconstructed nihilist, an assassin and a mercenary who serves the covert and violent agenda of the American government as an employee of the CIA. Dr. Manhattan, John Osterman at the back, is a being of unearthly power and the book's only true superhero in terms of his possession of supernatural powers. He is likewise a functionary of the American state who allows himself to be used as a weapon of grossly asymmetric war against Vietnamese communist rebels, who we see him incinerating them in vast numbers.
Oh, no, 5 minutes left.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Ozymandias, Adrian Veidt, uses his superior intelligence to become a sort of prototype Elon Musk, a successful capitalist who invents electric cars and pioneers genetic therapies that can resurrect long-dead species but which can't cure cancer. And then we have like Night Owl, Dan Dreiberg's a caricature of the ineffectual but well-meaning disillusioned US liberal who has failed to deliver on their ethical intentions and now comforts themselves with the obsolete trappings of their glory days and the righteous self-assurance that they tried their best and failed. And then we have Rorschach, Walter Kovacs, who despite Moore's later protestations is the closest thing the book has to a protagonist. He was a psychopathic libertarian vigilante. The motto of the story here, who watches the watchman, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, from the Latin, from the Roman poet Juvenal's satires, refers to the problem of how to find agents who can be trusted to enforce a moral order when all enforcers are themselves subject to corruption. This is a fundamental problem of the superhero genre. Who's going to enforce the law if Superman decides to go rogue? We see like the Nietzschean figure of the dominant and hypermasculine Superman, powerful in his individuality and without regard for the wider society from which he emerges, is most obviously applicable to like the figure of the giant blue Dr. Manhattan, raining fire and death on Vietnamese rebels, the empty amorality of the obedient superhero mobilized by the state. We can trace the genealogy of Moore's comics work back through his time as a writer for the Judge Dredd comic in 2000, called 2000 AD, that reveals his preoccupation with this sort of corrupt and violent enforcer of public morality, which is also a kind of savage parody of the police state. And so we can say that like almost uniformly, superheroes are entirely reactive and reactionary figures, seemingly incapable of taking proactive steps to bring about any kind of meaningful social change. Their attitude in general is more like that of firefighters, who can only respond to a fire that is already in progress, rather than that of a conscientious police force whose proactive presence in a society might deter or even prevent crime from happening. So it's thus a settled staple of the superhero genre that taking meaningfully proactive or preemptive steps to address the fundamental social problems that give rise to crime is just not something that superheroes do. They only react. These ageless, deathless figures become immobilized, as Echo says here, in a kind of emblematic and fixed nature. They embody a law or a kind of universal demand, reinscribing this idea of the supreme individual who is like given primacy and legitimated over the individuated and delegitimized. So in this signifying work, the figure of the superhero already lends itself to these kind of totalizing hierarchies of fascist politics. We don't have time to talk about Jenny Sparks. So the final superhero property, I'm almost finished, I want to consider today is a property that is close to the heart of many comics fans for its resonance with, like in many cases, marginalized identities, and that's the X-Men. So the X-Men, if you don't know, and there's no reason why you should, are a plucky group of genetic mutants in the Marvel universe. That is, they derive their powers not from any technological intervention or from natural disaster or cosmic rays or being bitten by a radioactive spider or because they originate from an alien planet, but purely as a result of a mutation in their genetic code. And this makes them subject, in the context of the Marvel Universe, to a great deal of racial discrimination. And X-Men storylines have always been concerned with the status of mutants as these like marginalized outsiders who are generally not accepted by the public in a way that, for example, the Avengers or Spider-Man generally are. And this diegetic marginalization of these characters has drawn many interpretations of their struggles as allegorical representations of one marginalized group or another, but most commonly as an allegory for queerness. And the potential parallels available to make such a case are certainly present. The mutant youths who form the X-Men are misunderstood, often ostracized by their families and friends, isolated by dint of the identity category to which they belong. They live in a world that is hostile and often violent towards them, and that sees them as an existential threat to the established social order. And so they form an outsider community of found family, playing for each other the roles of caregivers, parents, brothers, and sisters. Perhaps understandably then, the idea that the X-Men are an allegory for the experience of queer young people has become something very close to a canonical definition of what this comic means. And there's very little critical debate that seeks to challenge this interpretive orthodoxy. And surely if we accept that this interpretation is accurate, we may finally have found a way in which the figure of the superhero can come to stand against fascism as the avatar of a group that fascist politics near universally abhors and abominates. But therein lies the rub. The strength of this reading lies nowhere in the text itself. There are no queer characters or queer storylines in X-Men flagship comics, or at least not until very recently. There is never any concrete and explicit indication within the text itself that these characters or their storylines are sympathetic to queer identities or queer politics. The reading is just that. It's an act of interpretation based on analysis of the evidence. And as such, it's only as strong as the argument that connects it to that evidence. Because of course, there is another way to read the constitution and construction of the X-Men within the Marvel Universe. Let me reiterate these significant qualities. They are misunderstood, ostracized by families and friends, isolated by dint of their identity category. They live in a world that's hostile and often violent to them, that sees them as an existential threat, and so they form an outsider community of their own. And if we take a step back from the seemingly progressive impulse that drives the stories of the X-Men, it's easy to see how such a group can also be read as an allegory for fascists. Here is captured the rebelliousness that Chow refers to as a characteristic of fascism, the positioning against the established order. Here are the unshakable bonds of family, community, and love that bind fascist bodies together in alliance. Here are the idealized versions of the self, luminous, positive, and fundamentally different from the lesser ordinary people. And most tempting of all, here is a group defined primarily by a genetic distinction. an essential bodily marker written in their DNA that ramifies their superiority over the common herd. The reading of the X-Men as an allegory for misunderstood fascist youth is a deliberately provocative one, certainly. But as an interpretation of the actual text of the stories, it's no less legitimate a reading than the queer allegory. Both are acts of interpretation that reach a provisional conclusion on imperfect evidence. But I argue that a reading of the X-Men as avatars of fascism is actually a stronger and more persuasive analysis of the text, because the very nature of the figure of the superhero is to feed into Wertham's critique that these stories condition us to be passive, to surrender our agency to the powerful, to submit to the idealized image of the champion that represents our ideology, our nation, or other category of identity. And this argument is not simply a dry, dusty academic discussion anymore. Superhero media has been the predominant genre of production for blockbuster Hollywood movies since Robert Downey Jr.'s performance as charismatic billionaire defense industrialist Tony Stark in 2008's Iron Man. And it's no accident that Elon Musk, the money behind Donald Trump's recent election victory, is sometimes referred to as the real-life Tony Stark. Likewise, it is not a coincidence that a recent wave of social media protest erupted at Marvel's plans to incorporate the Israeli superhero Sabra, canonically a Mossad agent, into the storyline of the next Captain America movie. Superheroes breed fascism. And fascism needs superheroes. It needs those idealized figures onto which the hopes and dreams of decent people can be projected, with which they can identify and see themselves reflected in order to make palatable the horrors which they then unleash upon the world. Zizek has argued that there is no genocide without poetry. I respond by saying there is no fascism without a superhero. Thank you. That's all.